In the summer of 2021, a wildlife biologist named Mark Uptain was reviewing GPS collar data from a grizzly bear study unit in the Bridger-Teton National Forest when he noticed something that had not been in the data the previous season. A female bear, catalogued as female 399 in the study database, but known informally to researchers and to the broader wildlife watching community by a name assigned by the public, had begun making regular movements into areas of the forest where a decade earlier she had never been recorded. She was not moving into backcountry. She was moving toward the developed periphery, trailheads, campgrounds, the edges of small communities. She was not doing it occasionally and retreating. She was doing it with a consistency that the GPS points, rendered as a cluster of dots on a terrain map, made visually unmistakable. Something about her relationship to human-occupied space had shifted. She was not the only one. If you have spent any time following wildlife research coming out of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, out of Glacier National Park, out of the bear management corridors of British Columbia and coastal Alaska, you already know that this kind of observation is no longer unusual. It is becoming the baseline expectation in areas where grizzly bear populations are growing and where the boundaries of grizzly territory are pressing outward into landscapes that bear 100 years of accumulated human activity. What is unusual, and what has begun to generate a quiet but serious conversation among wildlife scientists that has not yet translated into the kind of public communication the situation warrants, is the pace of the change. The rate at which individual grizzly bears are losing the behavioral wariness of humans that wildlife managers have historically relied upon as a fundamental safety buffer is faster than the models predicted. It is faster than the management frameworks designed around those models were built to handle. And it is happening through mechanisms that are more varied and more difficult to interrupt than the standard narrative about habituation and food conditioning would suggest. Before going any further into what the current data is telling researchers, it is worth pausing to subscribe if you haven't already, because what follows is going to go considerably deeper than the surface-level coverage this subject has received in most places, and more content in this vein is worth having in your feed before the story gets away from you. The grizzly bear's relationship to human beings in North America has always been defined by a tension that is not fully resolved in either direction. On one side of that tension is the bear's ecological nature. Ursus arctos horribilis is a large, highly intelligent, behaviorally flexible omnivore whose ancestors arrived in North America from Asia somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, and who occupied the continent from the Pacific coast to the Mississippi River, from Mexico to the Arctic, before European settlement reorganized that distribution with extreme prejudice. The grizzly is not a specialist. It is not an animal built for one narrow ecological niche, the way a lynx is built for snowshoe hares or an osprey is built for fish. It is an opportunist of extraordinary capability, with the sensory acuity, the cognitive complexity, and the physical power to exploit a wider range of food sources in a wider range of conditions than almost any other land mammal on the continent. It is curious. It is persistent. It has an exceptional memory for locations, individuals, and outcomes. These are the traits that make it ecologically successful and that make the question of its behavioral relationship to humans particularly consequential. On the other side of the tension is the grizzly's historical response to hunting pressure. For most of the period following the arrival of Europeans with firearms, grizzly bears across most of their range were subject to intense lethal persecution. They were killed as livestock predators, killed as threats to human safety, killed as trophies, killed under bounty systems, killed on site in areas where their presence was considered incompatible with agricultural and pastoral use of the land. By 1975, when the species was listed as threatened under the newly enacted Endangered Species Act, the grizzly bear's range in the contiguous United States had contracted to approximately 2% of its historical extent. The populations that survived this persecution were concentrated in a handful of remote, largely roadless areas, where the intensity of human-inflicted mortality had been lowest. The bears in those surviving populations had been, for generations, subject to a selection pressure that strongly favored extreme wariness of humans. The bears that were wary survived. The bears that were not wary were killed. Over generations, this selection pressure produced a behavioral phenotype across surviving grizzly populations that wildlife managers came to regard as an asset, the primary behavioral buffer that reduced the frequency of dangerous encounters between grizzly bears and humans in the areas where the two species shared terrain. The wariness produced by that selection pressure is the behavioral baseline against which everything that is currently happening needs to be measured. It is not an absolute avoidance of human presence. Grizzly bears in areas like Yellowstone have always had some level of exposure to human activity, and the bears of coastal Alaska and British Columbia have coexisted with indigenous human communities and later with commercial fishing and tourism operations for long enough that zero human exposure is not part of their recent evolutionary history. But the baseline wariness, produced by a century of intensive lethal persecution, meant that grizzly bears in the lower 48 states and in the Canadian wilderness areas adjacent to those states consistently treated human presence as a signal that initiated avoidance behavior. They moved away. They changed their daily activity patterns to minimize overlap with human movement. They used terrain and timing to reduce the probability of close encounters. This behavioral pattern reduced the frequency of dangerous encounters far below what would be expected based on the distribution of the bears and the distribution of the humans occupying the same terrain. The wariness was doing enormous conservation work that almost no one was explicitly accounting for, because it was invisible in the way that effective prevention is always invisible. What is happening now is that the wariness is eroding, not uniformly, not irreversibly at the level of individual animals, not at a speed that produces a rapid, dramatic increase in fatal encounters that would register clearly in the public consciousness. But the erosion is real. It is documented in the behavioral data from multiple study populations across the species range in North America, and it is proceeding through several distinct mechanisms that interact with each other in ways that compound their individual effects. Understanding those mechanisms is the foundation of understanding why the problem is harder to address than the standard management frameworks suggest. The first and most widely discussed mechanism is food conditioning. This is the process most people think of when they think about bears becoming dangerous, and most of what they think they know about it is partially correct but insufficiently precise in ways that matter. Food conditioning occurs when a bear learns to associate human-occupied spaces with caloric reward. The classic version involves a bear discovering unsecured garbage, accessing it without negative consequence, and returning repeatedly to the same or similar sources. The bear is not becoming less afraid of humans because it has been exposed to humans. It is becoming less afraid of humans because it has learned that proximity to humans in specific contexts produces caloric benefit without meaningful cost. The fear response is not being extinguished. It is being overridden by the competing motivation of an animal that is, from an evolutionary standpoint, built to prioritize caloric acquisition with enormous intensity, particularly in the months approaching hibernation, when hyperphagia drives bears to consume up to 20,000 calories per day, and any reliable caloric source exerts an almost irresistible pull. The management response to food conditioning, the combination of secure food storage requirements education campaigns, and aversive conditioning programs that wildlife agencies have deployed across grizzly bear range for decades addresses the mechanism correctly, but has not been sufficient to stop it. The reasons for that insufficiency are structural and not easily resolved. Campsites in the backcountry generate food odors even when campers do their best, with bear canisters and proper food storage. Hunting camps with ungulate carcasses represent caloric opportunities of enormous magnitude. Agricultural operations, adjacent to grizzly habitat, produce consistently available food sources, grain storage, livestock, apiaries, orchards, that are both harder to secure than they appear and more attractive to bears than wildlife managers anticipated when the current regulatory frameworks were designed. The failure mode of food storage education is not ignorance. Most people recreating in grizzly country know the rules. The failure mode is the gap between knowing the rules and implementing them with the precision necessary to prevent exposure in an animal whose olfactory capability can detect human food odors at distances that make the concept of secure storage genuinely challenging to implement in open terrain. But food conditioning, as consequential as it is not the most important mechanism driving the current behavioral shift. It is the most discussed because it is the most intuitive and because it is the one that generates the clearest management intervention: remove the food reward, reduce the conditioning. The mechanism that is generating more concern among researchers who study grizzly behavior at the population level is something that operates more subtly and is considerably harder to interrupt. That mechanism is the decline in lethal selection pressure in recovering populations. The grizzly bears currently inhabiting the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem number approximately 700 individuals, up from an estimated 136 at the time of the 1975 listing. The Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, centered on Glacier National Park, hosts a population estimated at over 1,000 animals, expanding along corridors into Canada and into areas of western Montana that have not had resident grizzlies in living memory. These populations have been growing in a regulatory and social environment that is substantially different from the one that produced the behavioral phenotype of extreme human wariness in their ancestors. Grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem have been federally protected for nearly 50 years. The lethal selection pressure that shaped the behavioral baseline of wariness has been substantially reduced for nearly 2 generations of bears. The bears that were born in the 1990s and 2000s, and whose offspring are the animals filling out the expanding range today, grew up in a world where their first encounters with humans did not end in gunfire. For the vast majority of bears in these populations, close proximity to humans has not historically produced the negative outcomes that proximity to humans produced for their great-grandparents. The behavioral memory of humans as consistently dangerous is not being continuously refreshed by experience, the way it was during the persecution period. In the absence of that experiential reinforcement, the behavioral wariness that was originally produced by selection pressure is diffusing through the population. This is not the same thing as food conditioning. It is a subtler process. It does not require a bear to have accessed human food. It does not require a specific learning event. It operates across the population through the simple absence of the lethal consequences that historically reinforced wariness, and through the normal behavioral flexibility of a highly intelligent animal that updates its assessment of risk based on accumulated experience. A bear that has had 50 encounters with humans at a distance and has never experienced a negative outcome from those encounters has no experiential basis for treating the 51st encounter differently than it treated the first 49. Its wariness may persist as a residual behavioral tendency inherited from parents who had more negative experiences. But that residual wariness is not being reinforced by current experience, and residual behavioral tendencies that are not reinforced tend to fade in animals, with the cognitive sophistication to distinguish between historical patterns and current evidence. The third mechanism is demographic pressure. Grizzly bear populations are recovering not as a uniform expansion of the existing range, but as a directional expansion from core areas into peripheral and novel terrain. The animals making that expansion are disproportionately subadult males. This is consistent with the general mammalian pattern of male bias dispersal and is not specific to grizzly bears. What is specific to the current situation is the terrain into which those dispersing males are moving. The core areas of grizzly recovery, Yellowstone, Glacier, the Selkirks, are surrounded by landscapes that have been continuously and intensively occupied by humans for between 100 and 150 years. The corridors through which dispersing bears move are not remote wilderness. They are working landscapes, with ranches, logging operations, mining activity, agricultural land, rural residences, and road networks. A young male grizzly, pushing out from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem into the agricultural lands of southwestern Montana or the foothills of eastern Idaho, is not entering pristine wilderness, where he will slowly and cautiously encounter humans from a distance over many months. He is entering a landscape where human activity is ubiquitous and where the encounters come quickly and from all directions. The behavioral response of these dispersing males to this landscape is what is generating the data that has wildlife managers operating in the expansion zones losing sleep. Dispersing males are taking livestock at higher rates than established bears in core areas. They are approaching occupied structures at rates that suggest reduced wariness, or at least reduced wariness for terrain, even when direct human encounters still trigger avoidance behavior. They are accessing agricultural food sources, grain, fruit, livestock feed, at elevated rates that reflect both the caloric motivation of hyperphagia and the reduced behavioral inhibition that comes with the novel terrain experience of a young animal that has not yet been taught by lethal consequence to avoid human-associated resources. And they are doing all of this in landscapes where the human residents were not part of the social and political coalition that supported grizzly recovery, and whose tolerance for the behavioral consequences of that recovery is not unlimited and is being tested in ways that will have management consequences for years. The livestock depredation pattern is worth examining in detail because it is the place where the behavioral shift has the most direct and immediate consequences for the human communities living in grizzly expansion terrain, and because the management response to livestock depredation is the primary lever through which the lethal selection pressure on problem behavior is maintained in populations that are federally protected. When a grizzly bear kills a sheep or a cow, the rancher reports the depredation to state wildlife managers, who investigate, confirm the cause of death, provide compensation under the programs that exist in most states, and assess whether the animal responsible represents a public safety risk that warrants removal. The removal decision is the critical link in the chain that maintains behavioral selection pressure. If the bear that killed the sheep is removed before it has reproduced, the behavior that led to it approaching the sheep pen closely enough to make the kill is not passed on to offspring. If the bear is not removed, either because it cannot be identified and captured, or because the management bandwidth does not exist to respond to every depredation event, it continues to refine the behavior that led to the depredation, becomes progressively more effective and more comfortable with it, and may eventually pass both the behavioral tendency and the learned skills to its offspring. The compensation and removal system is under significant stress in both the Greater Yellowstone and Northern Continental Divide ecosystems because the frequency of depredation events has increased substantially, as bear numbers have grown and as bears have expanded into terrain where domestic livestock operations are concentrated. The administrative and financial capacity of the system was designed around a smaller population, producing a lower frequency of events. It has not kept pace with the growth of both. The result is management gaps, delayed response times, investigations that cannot definitively identify the responsible animal, and removal decisions that are deferred or declined in cases where they would previously have been executed more swiftly. Each management gap represents a missed opportunity to reinforce the lethal consequences for bold behavior that historically maintained the behavioral baseline. The food conditioning problem, the habituation from reduced selection pressure, the behavioral profile of dispersing subadults, and the management system stress all interact with a fourth factor that is rarely discussed in public wildlife communications, but that independent researchers studying grizzly behavior have been examining with increasing attention. That factor is learning, specifically social learning and the generational transmission of behavioral information within bear family groups. Grizzly cubs stay with their mothers for 2 to 3 years, a period of intensive behavioral learning during which the cub's fundamental behavioral repertoire, including its assessment of risk from humans, is being shaped by the mother's behavior. Cubs that travel with a mother who is habituated to human presence, who approaches developed areas without strong avoidance behavior, who has accessed human food sources or agricultural resources without negative consequence, are learning a behavioral template that includes a lower level of wariness about humans than the template their counterpart cubs traveling with a wilder, more wary female are learning. This transmission process has been documented in multiple study populations. Daughters of habituated females show elevated habituation rates relative to daughters of non-habituated females. The effect is stronger in daughters than in sons, because daughters establish home ranges that overlap substantially with their mother's range, giving them extended exposure to the same terrain and the same resource contexts that shape the mother's behavior. Sons disperse further and encounter conditions that may override what was learned in the maternal range. But the fundamental behavioral baseline established during the maternal learning period persists as a starting point, and a starting point with reduced wariness from a habituated mother is a lower starting point than what a cub with a wary mother begins from. Over multiple generations of bears, this transmission process has the potential to produce systematic, population-level shifts in the behavioral baseline that operate independently of any individual learning events, and that are essentially invisible in the short-term incident data that wildlife managers monitor. The change is accumulating in the behavioral profiles of individual animals who have not been food conditioned, who have not been reported as problem animals, and who appear in the data as normal bears behaving within normal parameters. Until they don't. The incident in which one of these animals produces a negative outcome is then treated as an anomaly, rather than as the expression of a population-level trend that has been building for years. The specific data on grizzly bear attack patterns in North America tells a story that requires careful reading because the numbers are small and the multiple variables are not easily disentangled in a limited data set. There are roughly 50 to 60 grizzly bear attacks on humans in the United States and Canada in a typical year. The vast majority of these are defensive encounters, bears that are surprised at close range and that make contact in a defensive response before withdrawing. A smaller number are predatory encounters, bears that approach humans with apparent predatory intent rather than in response to a perceived threat. The ratio between defensive and predatory encounters and the absolute frequency of both has been shifting in ways that researchers who have been tracking the data across decades find concerning. Predatory grizzly bear attacks, historically rare and concentrated among specific individual animals in specific circumstances, have been increasing as a proportion of total attacks in the documented record from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem since the mid-2000s. This is a small signal in a noisy dataset, and every researcher who has published work touching on it has been appropriately careful about the statistical limits of the analysis. But small signals in bear attack datasets are worth attention because the dataset is inherently small, because each observation represents a potentially fatal encounter, and because the mechanism by which the signal could be real is well understood and consistent with what the behavioral data from study populations is showing. A bear that is less wary of humans is more likely to approach them closely in contexts where a more wary animal would have withdrawn. Close approach in a context where the bear has not been surprised, is not defending cubs, and is not injured most closely approximates the preconditions for predatory behavior. The increase in predatory-type encounters is the downstream expression of the upstream change in behavioral wariness that the study population data has been documenting for over a decade. The landscape of grizzly bear recovery in the American West has changed dramatically in ways that interact with the behavioral dynamics in consequential and underappreciated ways. The trail network available to the hiking and backcountry recreation community has expanded substantially over the past 30 years, driven by public land access advocacy, improved mapping, and the growth of adventure recreation as a cultural practice. The number of human days spent in backcountry grizzly habitat has increased by an amount that no one has precisely quantified, but that is visibly large to anyone who has tracked the growth of backcountry recreation participation over the same period. The result is a landscape in which grizzly bears in core habitat areas like Yellowstone and Glacier are experiencing higher frequencies of human encounters than they were in the 1980s and 1990s, independently of any change in the bear population. Higher frequency of human encounters without negative consequences is the input that produces habituation. The mechanisms are the same as those described for mountain lions in the discussion of their behavioral relationship to humans, but the outcomes for grizzly bears are more consequential because of the magnitude of physical capability involved. A habituated mountain lion is a serious threat to human safety. A habituated adult male grizzly bear, which may weigh between 400 and 700 pounds and is capable of generating contact force that exceeds anything available to a human attempting to resist, represents a fundamentally different order of threat. The gap between a grizzly's capacity to harm a human and that human's physical ability to resist is wide enough that the behavioral deterrent of human assertiveness, which is the primary defense available to humans in mountain lion encounters, is far less reliable in grizzly encounters. A grizzly bear that has decided, for whatever reason, to continue a predatory engagement with a human being is extremely difficult to stop without a firearm or bear spray deployed at close range. The human stakes of behavioral change in grizzly populations are therefore higher per incident than they are for most other large carnivore species. Bear spray is worth a separate and careful discussion because its effectiveness, which is genuine and well documented in the defensive encounter context, has become a cultural artifact in the backcountry community in a way that has subtly altered the behavioral calculus of people moving through grizzly terrain. Bear spray works. The peer-reviewed literature on its effectiveness in defensive grizzly encounters is among the most robust in the applied wildlife management field. Studies of bear spray deployment in actual encounters show effectiveness rates that exceed those of firearms in most categories of encounter. The mechanism is straightforward. Oleoresin capsicum in the concentrations used in bear spray, when deployed into the face of an attacking bear, causes sufficient sensory disruption that the bear breaks off the attack in the overwhelming majority of documented cases. It is not a perfect deterrent. Nothing is. But it is a genuine and highly effective one in the specific context of a defensive encounter where a wary bear that has been surprised makes physical contact or near contact with a human, and the human deploys the spray before losing the physical capacity to do so. The limitation of bear spray, and the one that is not always clearly communicated in the education materials that present it as the primary safety tool for backcountry grizzly country, is that its effectiveness is highest in defensive encounters with behaviorally normal wary bears. Its performance in predatory encounters with habituated animals is less well documented simply because the sample size of such encounters is smaller. There are documented cases of bear spray effectively deterring predatory attacks by grizzly bears. There are also documented cases of predatory attacks in which spray was either not deployed in time, was not present, or did not stop the attack. The lesson is not that bear spray is ineffective. The lesson is that bear spray is a tool whose effectiveness is highest against the category of bear that is becoming less common relative to the category of bear whose frequency is increasing. Carrying bear spray remains essential. Treating it as a complete solution to the behavioral changes currently underway in grizzly populations is a category error. The garbage management story deserves specific attention because it is simultaneously the clearest management success story in the history of human grizzly conflict reduction, and a cautionary example of how complex the behavioral dynamics of the problem actually are. The transition of Yellowstone National Park's campgrounds and developed areas from open-pit garbage disposal to hardened waste management infrastructure in the 1970s and 1980s produced a dramatic and measurable reduction in food-conditioned grizzly bears within the park and a corresponding reduction in human-bear conflicts in developed areas. The management intervention was directly correct. Remove the food reward, and the conditioning process loses its primary driver. This success story became the template for garbage management recommendations across the broader grizzly range and produced genuine improvements in the areas where it was most completely implemented. It did not, however, eliminate the problem. It displaced it. The displacement took the form of bears, specifically dispersing subadults and bears operating on the margins of the garbage-managed core areas, discovering agricultural food sources outside the intensively managed zone. Apiaries, grain storage, orchards, livestock. These sources were not as easily secured as urban garbage infrastructure because they are not designed for security and because the economic cost of grizzly proofing an agricultural operation at the scale required to match the olfactory and physical capability of a food-motivated grizzly is substantial. The ranchers and farmers in grizzly expansion terrain who have been managing the behavioral consequences of that displacement are not characters in the success story of the garbage management intervention. They are experiencing a version of the problem that the successful intervention in the park, produced by redirecting the bears, it stopped conditioning on park garbage toward agricultural resources it did not simultaneously protect. The management success in one arena created a problem in another that has been accumulating for decades. The relationship between grizzly bear recovery and rural communities in the American West is the social substrate in which the behavioral changes being documented by researchers are playing out, and it is a relationship of sufficient tension and complexity that the scientific story of behavioral change cannot be told honestly without addressing it. The communities adjacent to grizzly bear recovery areas did not, as a general matter, vote for grizzly bear recovery. They have experienced the costs of recovery, livestock losses, restrictions on land use, reduced ability to defend themselves and their property under federal protection provisions, as an imposition from urban constituencies who bear none of those costs, and who maintain their support for recovery from a comfortable distance. This is not a caricature. It is an accurate description of the political economy of large carnivore recovery in the United States, and it has direct management consequences. The tolerance for grizzly bear presence in rural communities adjacent to the greater Yellowstone and Northern Continental Divide ecosystems is not unlimited. It is contingent on the perception that the costs of coexistence are being managed fairly, and that the institutions responsible for management are taking the concerns of affected communities seriously. When bears are not removed after repeated livestock depredations, because the management system is overloaded or because the legal framework makes removal complicated, the community tolerance for the recovery project contracts. When it contracts far enough, it produces the political conditions in which delisting from federal protection becomes achievable, in which state-level management decisions move quickly toward more aggressive population control, and in which extra-legal mortality, the shooting of bears, by people who are not going to report it, increases to a level that the monitoring system cannot reliably detect. Extra-legal mortality is not a hypothetical risk. It is documented in the genetic sampling from grizzly populations, where the cause of death of recovered carcasses is inconsistent with the expected distribution of natural and vehicle collision mortality at rates that suggest unreported anthropogenic mortality is occurring. The behavioral change story and the social tolerance story are not separate narratives. They are the same story told from different points of view. The question of what distinguishes a grizzly bear that will attack from one that will not, in conditions where both animals are habituated to some degree to human presence, is the question that most directly shapes what people who live and work and recreate in grizzly country need to know. It does not have a clean answer. The attack record, when examined carefully, reveals a cluster of conditions that characterize the highest risk encounters. But those conditions are not uniquely predictive in the way that would allow a simple rule to be applied by someone in the field. The conditions are an adult male, particularly a large and dominant one, in hyperphagia, approaching a human who is between the male and a large food source. A female with cubs of the year at close range in a surprise encounter. A subadult male in poor body condition who has been operating in human-adjacent terrain for an extended period and who approaches a human moving alone. Any bear that has been identified by managers as having made a physical approach to a human-occupied structure without clear defensive motivation. These conditions do not guarantee an attack. They are the conditions under which the probability distribution shifts in a direction that the baseline language of extreme rarity is no longer adequate to describe. The people most directly exposed to the behavioral shift in grizzly populations are not the backcountry hikers who read the trail safety literature and carry bear spray. They are the hunters moving through the Yellowstone backcountry in September and October with ungulate carcasses that serve as the most powerful grizzly attractant in the region. They are the ranchers checking fence lines on horseback at dawn in areas where resident bears have been tagged and returned multiple times. They are the researchers, the outfitters, the wildlife photographers, and the tribal members whose occupational or cultural relationship to grizzly terrain produces levels of exposure that recreational visitors do not accumulate. The attack record is not randomly distributed across these populations. It is concentrated in the people with the highest exposure, which is statistically predictable, but it is also shifting in ways that suggest the conditions of exposure that have historically been relatively safe are becoming less reliably so. The outfitter and guide community in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho has been among the most vocal about the shift in grizzly behavior, partly because their occupational exposure makes them unusually sensitive observers, and partly because the consequences of the behavioral shift for their businesses and for their clients are direct and immediate. Elk and deer hunting camps in the greater Yellowstone backcountry are now routinely subject to grizzly bear investigation and depredation of harvested animals at rates that experienced outfitters in the region describe as qualitatively different from what they saw in the same terrain in the 1990s. Bears approaching camps with less hesitation. Bears returning to defended food sources multiple times in the same night. Bears that have been hazed with non-lethal tools returning within hours, rather than departing the area for days. The bears are not acting like the grizzly bears these outfitters built their safety protocols around 20 years ago. The protocols have not kept pace because the institutional channels through which the outfitter community's observations could influence management frameworks are not designed to move at the speed the behavioral changes are producing. The researchers most deeply familiar with grizzly bear behavioral ecology and with the specific populations where the changes are most clearly documented have been navigating a communication challenge that is structurally similar to the one that wildlife agencies face in the mountain lion context, but that is complicated further by the political sensitivity of grizzly bear management. Grizzly bear recovery is one of the signal achievements of the Endangered Species Act. Its continuation is politically important to the conservation community and to the federal agencies whose mandate includes that act's implementation. Public communication that suggests the behavioral baseline of recovered grizzly populations is changing in ways that increase human safety risk creates a political opening for arguments that recovery has been too successful, that population levels are too high, that delisting and aggressive sport hunting are warranted. These arguments are made in bad faith by some of the people who make them, and in good faith by others. And the difficulty of distinguishing between them in real time produces a defensive crouch in the scientific and management community around data that would, in a less politically charged context, be communicated more directly. The defensive crouch is understandable. The conservation case for grizzly recovery is genuine, and the threat to that recovery from premature or politically motivated delisting is real. But the defensive crouch has costs that are not fully accounted for in the calculation. The people who need the behavioral shift data most urgently are not the people who would weaponize it against the recovery project. They are the people living and working in grizzly expansion terrain, whose safety depends on management responses calibrated to current behavioral conditions, rather than to the conditions of 20 years ago. They are the recreational users making exposure decisions based on risk frameworks that the current data suggests are no longer fully accurate. They are the state and federal managers whose population management decisions need to account for the behavioral dimensions of the recovery trajectory in addition to the demographic ones. Withholding or softening the behavioral shift narrative to protect the political viability of recovery is a trade that is being made on behalf of people who did not consent to it, and who are bearing the costs of it in ways that are not visible in the communications that come out of the institutional management apparatus. The specific geographic areas where the behavioral shift is most advanced and where the management challenge is most acute are worth naming specifically. The Paradise Valley north of Yellowstone National Park, where the transition from protected park terrain to private ranch land is abrupt, and where resident grizzlies have been documented taking domestic livestock and approaching occupied structures for over a decade, is perhaps the most intensively managed human grizzly conflict zone in the country outside of the park itself. The Blackfoot Clearwater Wildlife Management Area in western Montana, on the leading edge of the grizzly population expansion north and west from the northern Continental Divide ecosystem, is an area where bears, whose behavioral profiles suggest minimal wariness of human-dominated terrain, are appearing with increasing frequency in communities that have not had resident grizzlies in the memory of the people living there. The North Fork of the Flathead River drainage, adjacent to Glacier's western boundary, is an area where the density of both grizzly bears and permanent human residents produces a level of human-bear encounter frequency that is higher than anywhere else in the lower 48 states. In each of these areas, the pattern is similar. The initial encounters involve bears at the margins, at the edge of developed land, departing when humans are present, taking advantage of agricultural resources at night. Over time, the margins erode. The bears operate closer to structures in daylight. The departure response to human presence weakens. The temporal and spatial separation that initially characterized the coexistence collapses as the bear's habituation deepens and as the population pressure in the core areas pushes more animals into the expansion terrain. The ranchers and residents in these areas are the canaries in the management coal mine. What they are experiencing now is a more acute version of what the communities further into the expansion zone will experience in 5 to 10 years if the management response does not adapt to what the behavioral data is showing. The wildlife crossing infrastructure question is as relevant to grizzly bears as it was to mountain lions, though the spatial scale is different and the solutions consequently more challenging. Grizzly bears are wide-ranging animals that use landscapes at scales that make the wildlife crossing approach applicable to some barriers and inadequate to others. Interstate highways in the northern Rockies, particularly I-90 in Montana, represent genuine barriers to grizzly movement between the northern continental divide ecosystem and the Cabinet Yaak ecosystem, and the wildlife crossing structures that have been built along that corridor are producing measurable movement connectivity that the genetics data supports. The U.S. Highway 2 corridor, along the southern boundary of Glacier, the road networks threading through the valleys between the major ecosystem units in Idaho, the agricultural land mosaics that separate suitable grizzly habitat patches across southwestern Montana and the Wyoming Basin. All of these represent connectivity challenges that cannot be solved by a single structure, but that add up to a landscape that channels grizzly movement in ways that concentrate bears in specific areas and produce the population pressure and habitat limitation that drives the behavioral dynamics currently unfolding in expansion terrain. The management intervention that is most clearly indicated by the behavioral shift data and that is most directly in tension with the political constraints on grizzly bear management is the restoration of lethal selection pressure through legal hunting in states that have recovered populations exceeding their management targets. This is the most charged sentence in the management discussion and the one that requires the most careful handling. Legal hunting of grizzly bears in the lower 48 states ended with the 1975 listing and has not resumed, despite 2 attempts to delist the greater Yellowstone population in 2007 and 2017, both of which were successfully challenged in federal court. The conservation community's resistance to delisting and to the resumption of hunting is grounded in a genuine concern about the adequacy of the recovered population sizes relative to long-term viability standards, and in a well-founded skepticism about the management intentions of the states that would control hunting seasons after delisting. Those concerns are legitimate. They are not the only legitimate concerns in the conversation. The behavioral shift data suggests that the absence of hunting for nearly 50 years in a population that has recovered to several hundred animals in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem has contributed, along with the other mechanisms described, to a systematic reduction in the behavioral wariness that constitutes the primary safety buffer for humans coexisting with grizzly bears in that terrain. A management framework that maintains zero lethal selection pressure on behavioral boldness for decades is a management framework that will produce behavioral drift in the direction the data is showing, not because hunting is uniquely necessary, but because the behavioral selection pressure that hunting represents is one of the primary mechanisms through which boldness toward humans has historically been maintained as a non-adaptive trait in grizzly populations. Removing it for 50 years and expecting the behavioral baseline to remain stable is an expectation that the behavioral data is now challenging with some consistency. The aversive conditioning programs that have been deployed as an alternative to lethal removal for bears displaying early-stage habituation or problem behavior, represent the management middle ground between doing nothing and removing an animal, and their effectiveness is genuine but limited. Rubber bullets, cracker shells, beanbag rounds, hazing with trained dogs, and other non-lethal deterrent tools have documented effectiveness at temporarily increasing the avoidance radius of individual bears that are approached in ways that pair human presence with an aversive experience. The limitation is the temporal window of the effect. Aversive conditioning produces behavioral change that persists for variable periods depending on the individual animal's learning characteristics, the frequency of conditioning reinforcement, and the competing motivations available in the animal's current physiological state. A bear in hyperphagia, pulling 20,000 calories a day toward hibernation weight, has motivational priorities that are not easily overridden by a previous aversive conditioning experience when a high-caloric resource is immediately accessible. The conditioning has to be maintained with a regularity and intensity that management resources rarely permit, and when the maintenance lapses, the conditioned wariness fades faster than it was established. The monitoring systems available to grizzly bear managers have improved dramatically over the period of the recovery, and the data they produce has become the foundation of a management practice that is more sophisticated than anything available when the first recovery plans were written. GPS collar technology, remote camera networks, genetic sampling from hair snares, and stable isotope analysis that can reconstruct an individual bear's diet history across a season have collectively produced a level of individual and population-level behavioral data that makes the current behavioral shift visible in the dataset in ways that historical managers could not have detected. The monitoring infrastructure is not the limitation. The limitation is the translation of what the monitoring infrastructure is showing into management responses calibrated to current conditions and communications to the public that accurately represent the current risk landscape without serving as ammunition for bad faith political arguments against recovery. The visitors to Yellowstone National Park, who number in the millions annually and who constitute by far the largest single population of humans with high grizzly bear encounter rates in the lower 48 states, are the population most directly subject to the communication gap between what the behavioral data shows and what the official information environment tells them. The park's educational infrastructure around grizzly bear safety, while improved from what existed in the pre-regulation era of the 1960s and early 1970s, still centers on a risk framework that is calibrated to the historical behavioral baseline rather than to the current behavioral state of the population. The recommendation to stay on designated trails, travel in groups, make noise, carry bear spray, and maintain 100 yards distance from bears is correct and should be followed. The context missing from those recommendations is that the 100-yard distance is enforced by the park's behavioral wariness baseline, and that the wariness baseline is declining. Saying only that the rules are the same, without acknowledging that the behavioral conditions in which those rules were designed are changing, is accurate in a narrow sense and misleading in the sense that matters for the person making real-time decisions in the backcountry. The photography community deserves specific mention because it represents a niche population with extreme exposure and a cultural incentive structure that has been producing a pattern of behavior in grizzly habitat that is identifiable in the encounter record and that has implications beyond the photographers themselves. Wildlife photographers in areas of grizzly concentration, particularly in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem where specific individual bears, like the ones in Hayden Valley and Lamar Valley, are well known and attract dedicated followings, have been documented approaching bears at distances that are below the park's minimum viewing standards in pursuit of images. The bears in areas with high photographer density have been subject to thousands of hours of close human presence without negative consequence over the course of their lifetimes. They are among the most habituated bears in the ecosystem. They are also among the most photographed and the most individually familiar to the public, which produces a cultural attachment that complicates management responses to the behavioral profiles they demonstrate. You cannot easily remove a bear that half the internet considers a personal acquaintance. And you cannot easily communicate the behavioral management concerns about a specific individual when the individual has a fan community that responds to management actions involving that animal with the emotional intensity usually reserved.